The Waste Land is a powerful poem full of striking images and rooted in classical literature, from Chaucer and Dante to Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. It is an agonising poem of a search for spiritual fulfilment in a spiritually bereft and hopeless world. It's up to the reader to decide if by the end of the poem Eliot has resolved the difficulties that he so eloquently describes. The poem is preceded by a short verse given in the Latin and ancient Greek, from Petronius's book The Satyricon. Translated it reads, "For I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl of Cumae hanging in a cage, and the boys were talking to her. 'What do you want, Sibyl?' And she answered, 'I want to die.'" The reference reflects the literary and cultural learning that Eliot brings to the poem. This verse refers to the story of the fortune teller, the Sibyl of Cumae, who had the temerity to ask the god Apollo for as many years of life as there were grains of sand in her hand. Apollo granted her wish, but as a result she simply grew older and weaker until she yearned for death. Life had become a cage and she a spectacle for the boys. She provides a vision of moral emptiness, of life having lost its charm and death the only release. Sibyl is related to two figures that come later in the poem, Madame Sosostris and Tiresias. The poem begins with the first part, entitled "The Burial of the Dead," a phrase from the Anglican burial service. The first 6 lines turn attention back to the opening of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. April is the month in which pilgrims travelling to Canterbury Cathedral, the place in which St Thomas Becket was martyred, are setting off from London. It is a moment for optimism, the beginning of a season of warmth and new growth. Chaucer writes, "When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March, and the root and all, the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of a flower." Eliot contrasts the mood of Chaucer's verse with his own rather more depressing view. There is a sense in which the writer was able to hide away from the world beneath the snow, to retreat from life in a kind of spiritual hibernation. This spirituality, the roots or tubers from which the flower will grow, are bathed by the moisture of Chaucer's showers, the optimism of the pilgrimage, whereas in Eliot's poetic vision they are dulled and dry in the earth. The opening tone is then lightened by the reference to summer coming to a lake near Munich in Bavaria, the Starnberger Sea. The pre-First World War European aristocracy, taking what was to be their last opportunity to enjoy the mountains and the snow. The German quote means, "I am not Russian, I come from Lithuania, pure German," and is a nod in the direction of German nationalism that was a factor in the terrible slaughter of the First World War. The Archduke is Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination in Sarajevo provided the spark that started that war, and Marie is Countess Maria Larisch, a member of the European aristocracy. There's a poetic melancholy insofar as this is now a world that has fallen away. We then return to the theme of dryness. Chaucer's roots were bathed in water, but these roots have to clutch for their moisture. The reference to the Son of Man comes at this point from Ezekiel chapter 2 verse 1. It says, "He said to me, 'Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you.'" It is Ezekiel who God is giving this title that is later associated with Christ. Ezekiel was being called to preach against the wickedness of the Israelites and to break the stone idols that they have taken as their gods. There is no comfort, writes Eliot, in the desert and no water. The poet is describing a spiritual dearth, a distancing from God that is like being in the comfortless desert with nothing to drink. We have an inner resource within us that might provide some shade, and we are being invited to come into that shade under the red rock. This is a reference from Isaiah chapter 32 verse 2. A man shall be as a hiding place from the wind and a covert for the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty, weary land. These and the following lines, and I will show you something, through to rising to meet you, are a pointer towards another poem by Eliot, The Death of St. Narcissus. The second line, I will show you fear, reminds us of the inevitability of us all coming to dust. There is then a quote from the legend of Tristan and Isolde, translated, "The wind blows fresh towards the homeland, my Irish child, where are you waiting?" These words proclaim Tristan's yearning for Isolde that parallels the poet's yearning for spiritual comfort. The next verse sounds as if it might be more optimistic. They call me the hyacinth girl, but no, more misery awaits us. You gave me hyacinths refers to the resurrection of the legendary Greek youth Hyacinthus. As he died, his blood was spilled, but from his blood he was resurrected as the hyacinth flower. Unfortunately, there is no resurrection or spiritual rebirth for the poet. This section, ending with a further quote from Tristan and Isolde, "Waste and empty is the sea," reinforces the poet's sense of hopelessness. The poem now moves to a busy episode with Madame Sosostris, the clairvoyant. As with Sybil in the preliminary verse, she represents a superstitious spiritual vacuity. Madame Sosostris reads from a pack of tarot cards, a pagan method of prophecy that, according to Jessie Weston, the scholar and folklorist, dates back to the Egyptian times. Some of the cards in the tarot pack include illustrations from the story of the Holy Grail, or Chalice. This story lies at the centre of the legend of King Arthur and the search for the cup that is supposed to have been used by Jesus and the disciples at the Last Supper. In the Christian Church, a ritual cup, or chalice, is used to serve the communion wine to worshippers. The Holy Grail has come to represent spiritual fulfilment and will be referred to again in the poem. The drowned sailor with pearls in his eyes comes from the song of Ariel in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, when he suggests to Ferdinand that his uncle, King Alonso, has been transformed by drowning into something rich and strange. Belladonna, beautiful lady in Italian, refers in this case to the Virgin Mary. Eliot associates the image of a beautiful woman with the spiritual beauty of Christ's mother. This beauty is represented in Leonardo da Vinci's painting The Madonna of the Rocks. Eliot draws a connection between the Virgin Mary's classical and moral beauty as well as her association with death and resurrection. Belladonna is also a poisonous flower used in cosmetics. While the poison brings temporary youth to the user, it may eventually hasten her death. The card with the man with 3 staves is associated with the Fisher King, who in the Arthurian legend is known as the Wounded or Maimed King. His task was to keep safe the Holy Grail. Some stories have him wounded in the groin and as a result impotent. All he is able to do is fish in a small boat on the river near his castle and wait for someone to come and heal him. The wheel also in the tarot pack is the Wheel of Fortune, the predestined cycle of good and evil. The one-eyed merchant is another tarot illustration and is associated with Mr. Eugenides, a man of limited vision, both literally and spiritually. He will appear again later in the poem. According to Jessie Weston, Levantine traders such as Mr. Eugenides carried written, religious beliefs and legends in their baggage that they did not themselves understand. Madame Sosostris is not able to enlighten us about the meaning of this card. The hanged man, sometimes associated with Christ, represents a sacrifice that is made in order to ensure regeneration and fertility. The card that shows men walking round in a ring parallels Dante's description in the Inferno of the inhabitants of hell occupying and walking round rings at different levels, depending on the nature of their sins. Finally, Madame Sosostris gives thanks to the listener who presumably has paid for the consultation. The final part in this opening poem of the Waste Land brings us to the unreal city, which is London. Baudelaire describes it as a swarming city full of dreams, where the ghost in broad daylight stops the passer-by. The phrase, "I had not thought death had undone so many," again comes from Dante as he describes the dead swarming towards the gates of hell. These people are outside the knowledge of Christian teachings and lived simply for their own ends, without any awareness of moral obligations and duties that are a part of the Christian teaching. They are melancholy. In Dante's words, with no lamentation except the sighs which cause the air to tremble. They desire God, but are without hope. It's a bit like travelling today on the London Underground. St Mary's bell in Woolnoth strikes the 9th hour, at which, according to Gospel writers, Christ died. The 9th hour for the Gospel writers was 3 p.m. The poet sees somebody he knows with the unlikely name of Stetson, and Mylea was the site of the first battle of the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. The reference to the planting of the corpse refers to an ancient Egyptian story of the death of Osiris, who was killed and dismembered by his envious brother Set, and his remains buried in different places. His wife, Isis, made these places holy and planted wheat seeds at each of them. The wheat that grew was then seen as the resurrected Osiris. The dog that the reader is ordered to keep hence may refer in part to the dog star Sirius, which was associated with the annual flooding of the Nile and the fertilizing the land, and was therefore seen as the friend of man. But this reference may also reflect the words of Cornelia in John Webster's 1216 play, The White Devil. She talks of the friendless bodies of unburied men and gives a warning to keep the wolf far hence that's foe to men, for with nails he'll dig them up again. The final line of French in the poem is from Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil. Translated, it says, "Hypocritical reader, my fellow man, my brother." Eliot is saying that the stupidity, error, sin and meanness, but worst of all, the boredom and spiritual emptiness explored in this poem, affects us all. As you will immediately see in this first part of The Waste Land, Eliot is a severe critic of the human condition, and he doesn't mince his words. This opening is not a happy poem. The years of the early 1920s, when it was published, were overshadowed by the terrible recognition of what humans could do in mechanised warfare, and a sense of the hopelessness for humankind into the future. But Eliot seeks to channel this state of mind into something beautiful, a poem which, as we can see, is richly embedded in the literary and cultural tradition of England and Europe. What might this poem mean for us today, just about 100 years later? The spiritual poverty that Eliot refers to is addressed by him personally when he later becomes a member of the Anglican Church, but this is a path not widely taken in our more secularly minded age. What is the relevance to us in our predominantly secular lives of the idea of spirituality? The images of the poem are beautiful, But does the poem speak to us at all at any deeper philosophical level than that of its images? The next part in Eliot's grand poem, The Waste Land, is entitled The Game of Chess and is discussed in the next presentation.